The galaxy had changed irrevocably. The once fragmented, vulnerable human colonies had transformed into a unified force. Their newfound strength, driven by the shared will to protect, had disrupted the delicate balance of power in the galaxy. What had started as a single act of defiance, Lily's abduction, had sparked a revolution, one that rippled across every corner of known space. Humanity had awakened, and they would never again be the silent observers of galactic politics. They were no longer the weak, scattered species that other powers had dismissed. The Oloriths, who had once acted as silent protectors, now watched as humanity stood at the center of a new age. It was not a time of conquest, but one of unity. The human colonies, once divided and isolated, were now bound together by a common cause: the preservation of their people and their place in the galaxy. As the years passed, humanity's alliances grew. The other species that had once looked down upon them now found themselves at the table, negotiating, cooperating, and sometimes even fearing the human collective. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. Humans, once considered a minor race, had become a formidable political and military force. The lesson had been learned. The price of harming humanity was far too high. The Drakari, who had once terrorized the galaxy with their brutal conquests, were no longer a threat. Their empire was gone, and the survivors of their race had either been absorbed into the growing human alliances or flowed into the farthest reaches of space, where their power was no longer a danger. The Oloriths, who had struck down the Drakari with such precision, now saw the fruits of their intervention. They had saved humanity, but it was humanity's own will that had carried them to this point. And it was Lily, the child who had once been a mere pawn in the hands of the Drakari, who had become a symbol of everything humanity had fought for. Her name was now spoken with reverence throughout the galaxy. She was not just the face of a revolution, but the heart of it, a living testament to the resilience of humanity and the power of a single individual to change the course of history. But Lily did not seek glory. In the years following her rescue, she had grown into a young leader, quiet, thoughtful, and wise beyond her years. She traveled to the far reaches of human space, speaking to those who had once been on the edges of society, reminding them of the strength they had within. Her message was simple, but powerful. Together, we are unbreakable. The Oloriths, who had once viewed humanity with indifference, now saw them as something more. They recognized the potential of the human spirit, and as the years went by, they offered their guidance and support in a way that had once seemed unimaginable. The Oloriths had always respected strength, but they had come to respect humanity for something deeper: their ability to rise above fear, to unite in the face of adversity, and to fight for the future. As humanity continued to grow in power, the galaxy watched in awe. Other species began to rethink their strategies, knowing that humanity could no longer be ignored or underestimated. The age of human dominance was not one of violence or oppression, but one of cooperation, of forging alliances, and of setting new standards for what it meant to thrive in the stars. The Oloriths, in their wisdom, had given humanity a chance. They had delivered their warning, and humanity had risen to meet it. Now they watched as the galaxy was reshaped before their eyes. Lily's legacy was more than just a victory over the Drakari. It was the beginning of a new era, one in which humanity would play a pivotal role. And so, the galaxy moved forward, forever changed by a single act of defiance, a single human child, and the Olorith's warning that no one would ever forget: harm a human child, and you'll pay the price. The Drakari were a ruthless and barbaric species, feared throughout the galaxy for their brutal conquests and their unyielding thirst for power. They had no interest in diplomacy, no need for alliances. Only strength mattered to them. They had swept across countless systems, enslaving weaker races, taking what they wanted, and crushing anyone who dared to oppose them. To the Drakari, there was no honor in peace, only in domination. It was on a remote human colony that the Drakari found their next target: a young girl named Lily. Her family lived in a quiet, isolated settlement on the fringes of a planet far from the core worlds. The Drakari, having heard rumors of a human child with extraordinary intelligence, saw an opportunity. They were not interested in the child for her mind, however. To them, she was nothing more than a pawn, a tool to be used in their endless experiments to find new ways to exert control over others. The Drakari warlord, known for his viciousness, made the decision to abduct Lily. His orders were simple: capture the child, experiment on her, and use her as a weapon. To him, the Olorith's warning meant nothing. Humans were weak, fragile, no match for the Drakari's strength and cunning. And even if the Oloriths did intervene, they were an ancient species, bound by their own laws and limitations. Surely they would not risk their reputation over one human child. So, under the cover of darkness, the Drakari struck. Their soldiers descended on the colony with brutal efficiency, using their superior technology to overpower the unsuspecting humans. Lily's family, caught off guard, had no chance to defend her. Her parents could only watch in horror as their daughter was taken by the Drakari, dragged from their home, and whisked away into the night. The moment Lily was taken, her family sent a desperate distress signal across the stars. It was a cry for help, one that would reach the ears of any who might listen. They had no hope that anyone would come to their aid. The galaxy had long since turned a blind eye to the fate of humans. But what they didn't know was that the Oloriths were already watching. They had seen the Drakari's move, and they knew what it meant. The Oloriths were not like the other species of the galaxy. They did not need to wait for a call to action. They had already made their decision. The moment Lily was taken, the Oloriths moved. To the Drakari, the human child was nothing more than a tool, an experiment, a means to an end. But the Oloriths knew that to harm her would be to make an enemy of an entire species, one that was more than capable of defending itself, even against the most powerful forces in the galaxy. The Oloriths had warned the galaxy, harm a human child, and you'll pay the price. But as the Drakari turned their attention to their captive, they had no idea that they had just made a mistake that would cost them everything. The consequences of their actions were about to unfold in a way they could never have imagined. The Oloriths did not waste time. The moment the Drakari took Lily, they knew the galaxy had crossed a line. The Oloriths' fleet, silent and efficient, was already on its way. Their ships moved through the void of space with the grace of predators, swift and unseen. The Oloriths had no need for grand gestures. They operated in silence, with a precision that could be felt even in the cold depths of space. The Drakari had made a critical mistake, one they would regret. They underestimated the wrath of an ancient species whose promise had been etched into the stars, and they had underestimated humanity's resilience, a trait that, unknown to them, had already begun to shape their fate. Lily's family, though devastated and powerless, sent out their distress call in vain. The Oloriths had heard it long before the signal reached any galactic authorities. It was not a plea that would go unanswered, but the Oloriths had their own reasons for intervening. The fate of a single child, it seemed, had become something more than a mere act of vengeance. It was a statement, a message to the galaxy. As the Olorith ships approached the Drakari's stronghold, the vast, heavily fortified world that held Lily, they began to deploy their agents. These were beings unlike any other in the galaxy, stealthy, fast, and deadly. The Drakari had always believed themselves to be the most formidable warriors in the galaxy, but the Oloriths showed them otherwise. Their agents moved like shadows, slipping past defenses with ease, finding their way into the heart of the Drakari fortress. In the darkness, a silent war raged. The Oloriths did not fight with brute force, but with strategy. They dismantled the Drakari's empire piece by piece. Where the Drakari relied on chaos and power, the Oloriths relied on order and precision. Their strikes were surgical, leaving the Drakari in disarray. Systems began to fail, defenses fell apart, and once proud Drakari warships were reduced to floating wreckage in space. Back on the ground, Lily remained imprisoned, unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. She was scared, but she was not broken. Humans had a unique strength that even the Oloriths had come to recognize: resilience. Despite the terror of her captivity, Lily's spirit remained intact. In the depths of her fear, she knew that something was coming to save her. The message from the Oloriths still echoed in her mind, faint but certain: harm a human child, and you'll pay the price. What the Drakari did not realize was that Lily herself was not just a child. She had become a symbol, a living embodiment of the very warning the Oloriths had issued across the galaxy. As her captors focused on their experiments, oblivious to the Oloriths' approach, Lily found an inner strength she didn't know she possessed. She began to resist, not with violence, but with defiance. She refused to submit to the Drakari, refusing to be a pawn in their cruel games. Each day, her will grew stronger. She was a human child, yes, but she was also something far more dangerous to those who underestimated her. She was hope. As the Oloriths closed in, the Drakari realized, too late, the cost of their actions. They had taken a human child, and in doing so, they had set something in motion that could never be undone. The galaxy was about to learn that no species, no matter how powerful, was beyond retribution, and the price for the Drakari's mistake would be steep. The moment the Oloriths made their move, the Drakari's fate was sealed. What had seemed like an unthinkable alliance of power and destiny began to unfold with ruthless precision. The Oloriths had never acted out of emotion. They were not impulsive. But the Drakari had broken a rule that even the most hardened species knew to respect: never harm a human child. The Oloriths' fleet arrived at the Drakari world like a storm, silent and unstoppable. The Drakari, who had long considered themselves the undisputed masters of war, were unprepared for the unrelenting speed and precision with which the Oloriths attacked. Their massive warships, usually so overwhelming in their firepower, were helpless against the Oloriths' advanced technology. The Oloriths moved like shadows, slipping past defense systems, disabling weapons, and causing chaos with calculated efficiency. In a matter of hours, the Drakari's once proud fleet was reduced to burning wreckage in the void of space. As the Oloriths cut through the Drakari defenses, their ground agents infiltrated the heart of the Drakari fortress. They moved like specters through the warlord's stronghold, bypassing layers of security with ease. The Drakari tried to fight back, but their strength was nothing compared to the cold, measured force of the Oloriths. The agents were everywhere, dismantling their war machine from within, making it clear that the Oloriths had no intention of negotiating or making peace. This was not just a rescue mission. It was an execution of the Oloriths' warning. The warlord who had given the order to capture Lily, Zarkoth, a brutal and bloodthirsty Drakari leader, found himself cornered. His empire was collapsing around him. His elite guards, who had once been unstoppable, were falling one by one. The walls of his stronghold were crumbling under the weight of Olorith strikes. Desperate, Zarkoth tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. His own people had begun to turn on him, realizing that his decision had led to their destruction. It wasn't long before Zarkoth was captured, dragged from his throne by the very soldiers who had once idolized him. The Oloriths had no mercy for those who broke their promises. As the warlord was brought before the Oloriths' agents, his fate was sealed. He was given no trial, no chance to defend himself. The price had already been paid, by him, by his people, by his entire empire. The Oloriths made an example of him. In front of his followers, his once loyal subjects who had once seen him as a god, Zarkoth was stripped of his power. His empire crumbled, and the remaining Drakari forces scattered, leaders lost, and a once feared race was reduced to chaos. To the galaxy, the message was undeniable: harm a human child, and you will pay the price. The galaxy watched as Zarkoth's empire fell, as the Drakari's hubris turned to ashes. The Oloriths made sure that no Drakari ship, no Drakari world, would ever forget the cost of breaking this one simple rule. But amid the ruin, Lily was freed. The Oloriths, having dealt their punishment, turned their attention to the child they had come to protect. She was the reason for the destruction. Her fate had been the spark that ignited the chain of events, and though she had endured so much, Lily remained calm, undaunted by the devastation around her. In the eyes of the Oloriths, she was not just a child. She had become a symbol. Lily's eyes met the Oloriths' leaders, and they knew something had changed forever. Humanity, in all its fragile yet indomitable glory, had shown the galaxy that they could no longer be ignored. The Oloriths had delivered their retribution. And the price? It was far steeper than anyone had anticipated. In the aftermath of the destruction of the Drakari Empire, there was a strange silence that fell over the galaxy. The Oloriths, ever the enigmatic and detached figures, had fulfilled their promise. The Drakari had paid the price for their actions, their power reduced to nothing. And Lily, the child at the center of this storm, stood untouched by it all. But what the Oloriths and the galaxy did not expect was the strength she carried within her. Lily had endured more than any child should, abducted from her home, taken to a strange and terrifying world, and subjected to the cruelty of the Drakari. Yet she had never once broken. The fear she had felt when the Drakari took her was real, but it had never consumed her. Through the days of captivity, in the cold and unfamiliar environments of the Drakari stronghold, Lily had kept a quiet strength. She refused to let them see her fear, and in doing so, she had become more than a mere prisoner. She had become a symbol of human resilience. When the Oloriths arrived and freed her from the Drakari's clutches, they found a girl unlike any they had encountered before. Her calmness in the face of the chaos around her unsettled them. The Oloriths were ancient beings, wise and powerful, yet they could not help but recognize that there was something in Lily that transcended mere survival. There was a fire inside her, an inner strength that the Oloriths had not anticipated. Lily was not a passive victim. She wasn't the helpless child they had imagined. Far from it. As the Oloriths stood before her, ready to whisk her away to safety, she looked up at them with an unwavering gaze. Her eyes, wide with the wisdom of someone much older, locked onto theirs. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. "But I'm not just a victim. I won't be one." The Oloriths, who had seen civilizations rise and fall, who had encountered countless beings in their long existence, were momentarily taken aback. They had underestimated her, they realized, just as the Drakari had. She wasn't just a child to be protected or a tool to be used. She was a person, strong, independent, and capable of far more than they had imagined. And in that moment, the galaxy had always been divided, with each species locked within its own sphere of influence, driven by its own agendas, its own desires. Some sought power, others sought knowledge, and some simply sought survival. But humanity, through the strength of one child, had begun to stir something deeper, something forgotten by most. Lily had shown that humans were capable of something far more dangerous than simple survival. They were capable of defiance, of resilience, and of unity. The Oloriths, who had long watched the galaxy from the shadows, knew that the balance was shifting. Lily's strength, her quiet determination in the face of overwhelming odds, had not gone unnoticed. Her resistance was not just an isolated act. It was the first spark in a fire that would spread across the galaxy. The Oloriths had protected her, but they understood that protecting her alone would not be enough. Humanity needed to be awakened. The Oloriths were wise, ancient beings who knew the value of patience. They had seen countless species rise and fall, and they had learned that true change never came in the form of conquest or brute force. It came from within, from the heart of a species. And humanity, it seemed, had just begun to realize its own power. Lily was not the only one to feel it. Across the galaxy, humanity was waking up. The message had spread, quietly at first, but with increasing urgency. The Olorith's warning had been heard, and it resonated deeply within the human spirit. Harm a human child, and you will pay the price. It wasn't just a warning. It was a challenge, one that resonated with every human who had ever known fear, who had ever felt powerless. It was a call to action. Human colonies that had once been isolated, vulnerable to the whims of more powerful species, began to organize. Formerly peaceful planets, where humanity had been content to live quietly under the radar, found themselves taking a stand. The Oloriths had given them the strength they didn't know they had. They had shown them that they were not powerless, that they could shape their own destiny. And as humanity began to unite, the galaxy began to take notice. The Drakari, broken and scattered, were not the only ones who feared the consequences of harming the human. Every species that had once seen humanity as weak, expendable, or insignificant now saw the potential for something far more dangerous. The Oloriths had never intended to make humanity the center of the galaxy. They had only wanted to protect one child, one small piece of a larger puzzle. But as they watched the ripple effects of their actions unfold, they realized that the galaxy was about to witness the birth of a new power. Humanity's awakening would change everything. Lily, once the symbol of innocence and vulnerability, had become something more. She had become the face of a new era for humankind, a symbol of what they could achieve when united, when willing to fight for one another. Her name spread across the stars, whispered in every corner of the galaxy. The child who had defied the Drakari was now the spark of a revolution. But the Oloriths knew that the path ahead would not be easy. They had set the stage for something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. And while humanity had proven its strength, the galaxy was far from ready for what was coming next. The Oloriths had always known that change would come, but they had never imagined that it would be humanity who would lead the charge. And so, as the first signs of this new human uprising began to take shape, the Oloriths watched from the shadows, knowing that they had only just begun to witness the true power of humankind. The galaxy had underestimated them before, but that was about to change. The age of humanity was dawning, and nothing would ever be the same again. The awakening of humanity did not happen in a single moment, nor did it begin with a grand battle or overwhelming victory. It began quietly, in the hearts and minds of those who had once believed their fate was out of their hands. It began with the realization that they were no longer just subjects in the galaxy's vast, indifferent theater. They were players now, and they had the power to write their own story. Across the galaxy, human colonies began to stir. What had once been isolated outposts, small settlements on distant worlds, now found themselves in contact with one another. The Oloriths had set the spark with their warning, but it was humanity's inherent drive to survive and protect that had spread the flame. The message had been clear: protect your own, and the galaxy will respect you. Harm a human child, and you will pay the price. At first, the leaders of the human colonies had been hesitant. For generations, humanity had lived under the shadow of more powerful species. The notion of standing up to those who had once dominated them seemed impossible. But with Lily's name on their lips, with the image of the Olorith's swift vengeance fresh in their minds, something began to shift. The once fractured colonies began to unite, forming networks of support, sharing resources, and organizing in ways they never had before. And the Oloriths, observing from their distant vantage point, saw that the galaxy had already begun to change. The once disparate human settlements were now finding common cause. They shared a bond that transcended borders, that transcended their differences. It was a bond forged not by the threat of war or the desire for power, but by the shared will to protect what mattered most: their children, their families, and their future. Humanity's strength was not in their weapons or technology, but in their unity. As the colonies began to join forces, forming alliances and establishing trade networks, they discovered something they had long forgotten. Their greatest asset was each other. They no longer fought alone. They no longer stood as isolated groups scattered across the stars. The galaxy had underestimated humanity's capacity for unity, for working together toward a common cause. The Oloriths, who had been quiet observers of the galaxy's countless cycles of rise and fall, now saw the birth of a new force in the universe, one not born of power, but of cooperation. It was this unity that made humanity dangerous, not just to the Drakari, but to any species who sought to harm them. The message had been sent, and now it was being heard. Humanity had proven that it could stand together, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Where once they had been scattered, weak, and divided, they were now a force to be reckoned with. The Ulleriths had shown them their potential, but it was humanity's own spirit that had done the rest. It was a spirit that could not be broken, a spirit that would never again accept being silenced or oppressed. As the human alliances continued to grow, the Ulleriths began to consider what this meant for the galaxy. Humanity was no longer a small, insignificant species. They were a force that could shape the galaxy's future, a species that had found its place among the stars. But the Ulleriths also knew that with this newfound strength came challenges. The galaxy had never been kind to those who rose up from obscurity. There were others who would not take kindly to humanity's new unity and the power it represented. The Ulleriths had no doubt that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But what they also knew, more than anything, was that humanity was no longer a species that could be ignored. The rise of human unity was just the beginning. The galaxy had witnessed the power of a single child, and now it was watching as the entirety of humanity began to stand together. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, and in the years to come, the universe would remember the name of Lily, the girl who sparked humanity's rise, and the Ullerith's warning that would echo through history. The galaxy had changed irrevocably. The once fragmented, vulnerable human colonies had transformed into a unified force. Their newfound strength, driven by the shared will to protect, had disrupted the delicate balance of power in the galaxy. What had started as a single act of defiance, Lily's abduction, had sparked a revolution, one that rippled across every corner of known space. Humanity had awakened, and they would never again be the silent observers of galactic politics. They were no longer the weak, scattered species that other powers had dismissed. The Ulleriths, who had once acted as silent protectors, now watched as humanity stood at the center of a new age. It was not a time of conquest, but one of unity. The human colonies, once divided and isolated, were now bound together by a common cause: the preservation of their people and their place in the galaxy. As the years passed, humanity's alliances grew. The other species that had once looked down upon them now found themselves at the table, negotiating, cooperating, and sometimes even fearing the human collective. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. Humans, once considered a minor race, had become a formidable political and military force. The lesson had been learned. The price of harming humanity was far too high. The Drakari, who had once terrorized the galaxy with their brutal conquests, were no longer a threat. Their empire was gone, and the survivors of their race had either been absorbed into the growing human alliances or flowed into the farthest reaches of space, where their power was no longer a danger. The Ulleriths, who had struck down the Drakari with such precision, now saw the fruits of their intervention. They had saved humanity, but it was humanity's own will that had carried them to this point. And it was Lily, the child who had once been a mere pawn in the hands of the Drakari, who had become a symbol of everything humanity had fought for. Her name was now spoken with reverence throughout the galaxy. She was not just the face of a revolution, but the heart of it, a living testament to the resilience of humanity and the power of a single individual to change the course of history. But Lily did not seek glory. In the years following her rescue, she had grown into a young leader, quiet, thoughtful, and wise beyond her years. She traveled to the far reaches of human space, speaking to those who had once been on the edges of society, reminding them of the strength they had within. Her message was simple, but powerful. Together, we are unbreakable. The Ulleriths, who had once viewed humanity with indifference, now saw them as something more. They recognized the potential of the human spirit, and as the years went by, they offered their guidance and support in a way that had once seemed unimaginable. The Ulleriths had always respected strength, but they had come to respect humanity for something deeper: their ability to rise above fear to unite in the face of adversity and to fight for the future. As humanity continued to grow in power, the galaxy watched in awe. Other species began to rethink their strategies, knowing that humanity could no longer be ignored or underestimated. The age of human dominance was not one of violence or oppression, but one of cooperation, of forging alliances, and of setting new standards for what it meant to thrive in the stars. The Oloriths, in their wisdom, had given humanity a chance. They had delivered their warning, and humanity had risen to meet it. Now they watched as the galaxy was reshaped before their eyes. Lily's legacy was more than just a victory over the Drakari. It was the beginning of a new era, one in which humanity would play a pivotal role. And so, the galaxy moved forward, forever changed by a single act of defiance, a single human child, and the Olorith's warning that no one would ever forget. Harm a human child, and you'll pay the price.